All right, so I'm Alex Grand, founder of the Comic Book Historians, social media, and I'm happy to present my fellow panelists. Let's introduce ourselves. Let's start with David Armstrong, then we'll move down.
I'm David Armstrong. I have been in the entertainment business for over 50 years, and mostly distribution, but I did some creative stuff too, but I've also been going to comic book conventions since 1965.
Good. Scott?
Hello everyone, my name is Scott Robinson, and I'm chair of the music department at San Diego Mesa College, and in comics I have worked with Alex and Comic Book Historians as an editor of several of their biographical book zines on Neal Adams and Frank Thorne and Howard Chaykin and David Anthony Kraft. We've done 2 graphic novels together, and I was the editor of this book, Understanding Superhero Comics, and founder of the Globo Comico International Comics social media.
All right.
I'm Bill Field. I'm a cartoonist, animator, author, and of the Neal Adams book. And I also produce a television series right now, and that's about it.
So the 2 big things that happened to me last year were finally finishing my book that I turned into McFarland, and the second thing was doing the post-production and editing on David's very famous now Golden Age and Silver Age interviews. It's pretty amazing that they were basically sitting in cold storage for a couple decades, and we talked, and we had a really fun collaboration putting them together. I'm excited to show you some of that here. It was great I upconverted him to the 4K because he filmed them in such high detail and great sound, so it was easy for me to upconvert it. And then also overlaid images. I kind of remixed the narrative so it fit more of like a podcast narrative format. And so, David, why don't you start kind of telling us about how you put these interviews together?
My first comic book show was in 1965. This is from 1966. It's the second time I wore a costume. But these are early photographs from the conventions that I went to. I started going in 1965. The first show that I went to, I saw a dealer who drew some pretty good stuff, and he had a number 2 who was working with him. The dealer was Jim Steranko, and the guy who was working with him was a guy named Ken Dixon. Ken Dixon was a high school student when I started, became a NYU film student, and then went to the American Film Institute, and I ended up going to the Film Institute with him. Now, in 1965, someone tapped me on the shoulder and said to me, would you like to meet the guy who created the Joker? And I said, sure. So he introduced me to Bill Finger, and I said, what's your name? And he said, Otto Binder. And so I kept that in the back of my mind as the first time I had met professionals at a comic book show. So I ended up going to AFI, and I started working on films there, and I ended up getting a job as a projectionist. And there were 3 things that I did as a projectionist. One was to run dailies for motion pictures that were and shorts that were being shot there. One was to do research screenings for people who were doing oral histories. And one was to do academic study to show potential directors and cinematographers how film was made. When I was doing when they cut down the research department, I kind of got bored because I was running mixes for student films, and I was running dailies for David Lynch on Eraserhead and John Cassavetes on A Woman Under the Influence. So I asked Cassavetes for a job because I wanted to leave and actually do something different. And he said, I can only pay you a certain amount of money. And I said, okay, I'll take it. And I started as a film editor for John, and then we started a film distribution company, and that's how I started my career. I ended up going to a comic book show in Philadelphia in 1993, and I was helping out Rob Rogovan, who was a dealer there. And Bob Overstreet comes up to the table and starts talking. Now, the only thing I knew about Bob is he was a pretty good inker on Landon Chesney in the old 60s. He was an inker on fanzines in those days. So we had a conversation, and I said to him, I told him the story about Otto Binder, and I said, unfortunately, he passed away right after that. And then when I went to the Film Institute, I realized that everyone was doing oral histories on cinematographers on musicians, on actors and directors. I said, and no one's done that for everyone other than like Jack Kirby or Stan Lee. And Overstreet looks at me and says, well, when are you going to start? And then I started going to work for USA Network in 1993. So I had access to the equipment. I had, a decent salary, and I thought it's time to go start doing this. So that's how we ended up working it out. So that's how the interviews came about, and I shot them over a 7-year period. And they they were shot in Beta SP, which at the time was broadcast standard for U.S. broadcast. And they sat, in the box, in the cases that they came in for the last 20 years. They've been used 2 or 3 times for film documentaries where I licensed the material. But other than that, they hadn't done anything until Alex said, we should do something with all that stuff. I said, yeah, but it would cost a lot of money to up convert it, and he said, okay. That was the beginning.
So we're basically going to go in a series of interviews that start from the 30s in their comic relevance and then lead up toward more like the 60s. So Dave's going to introduce us to Martin Filchock, who actually worked at Centaur Comics in the 30s.
So I'm going to play the clip, and I'll tell you a bit about my interview with Martin Filchock. He was a fascinating guy.
Going to Centaur, they had 2 gentlemen, one by the name of Joe Hardy and the other Harley. And they started this company, and they called it Centaur. And I would go into they had one special place where the art department was. That's where with Gilkinson, that's where he was we'd stand there and talk, and he would show me, and he was really a good artist. I used to hang around there a lot because I was in great demand. I would do covers for him and spots, and as you can see by my magazines and features that I've done, I did a lot of work for him.
Did they take over the same offices that Cook had before?
No, they moved to a different place. They had a much larger place. A fellow by the name of Jack Kay was their editor, Lloyd Jack Kay. And he looked over the cartoons, and he was a big help too. While I was there, I met Jack Cole, I met Bill Everett, and George Brenner, and a few others.
Martin was a guy who started working for Centaur, or actually U-Town before it was Centaur. Cook and McMahon had left working for Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson and started their own company, which eventually would become Centaur. And he started working for them doing covers and interior stories. When I interviewed him, he was 88 years old. He'd lived to be 100 years old, and he was still drawing at 100 and claimed to be the oldest continuously living comic book artist in the business. Actually, he said cartoonist, because he was doing crossword puzzle cartoons. But I'll tell you 2 quick stories about him, and then we'll move on. But there are 2 amazing things. First of all, I found out about where he was. He lived in Rogersville, Tennessee, which is up near the Smoky Mountains as you leave Knoxville. It's where Davy Crockett's grandparents lived, and they are actually buried there. But I hired a crew in Knoxville, so we spent the night in Knoxville, and I had to drive up there to see them at 9 o'clock in the morning. And so as we were looking for his place, we got lost. I had to call him and find out where he was, and he gave us directions. When we got there, he had already been out picking blackberries and had made blackberry cobbler for us. And it was still warm. I mean, this is a guy who's 88 years old, and he was taking care of his wife who was sick in bed. Anyways, so one thing I asked him about was the CC Kid. Now, the CC Kid is based on the Conservation Corps, which is basically a split between an amalgam of the WPA project and like the Boy Scouts. And it was, people who helped do projects, and they would be in an encampment, and then we'd send their money home. So I said, how did you come about doing the CC Kid story? Because there were several CC Kid stories in the Centaur books. And he said to me, I came home one day, my mom was crying. My mom said to me that my older brother, who had just gotten a scholarship to school, was going to have to go to work because her husband, their father, had lost his job. This is like 1936. So he ran out and joined the Conservation Corps, Martin. And he came back and said, you don't have to worry about, he didn't have to worry about your son going to work because there'll be enough money from the Conservation Corps. Well, he ended up going on that scholarship to school, and he became a quarterback for the Washington Redskins. So it kind of worked out for them.
All right, so now the next, we're going to talk about Will Eisner. So Scott, why don't you give us a 1-minute intro on Will Eisner and his significance in the 1930s, and we'll play that clip.
So Will Eisner was a very famous writer and artist that worked in comics, originally from Brooklyn, New York. He's known as the creator of the Spirit character and comic strip that ran from 1940 to 1952. He's also known for a particular type of experimentation in the content form of his work. He popularized the term graphic novel with the 1978 A Contract with God. And he also was involved in early comic studies with his book, Comics and Sequential Art, that was published in 1985. His father was an artist, and he began drawing when he was 19 in 1936 for Wow, What a Magazine. And then by 1940, he creates The Spirit as a comic book insert for newspapers that were published across the U.S. and Canada and even as far away as England. So the significance of this clip is not so much about Will Eisner and The Spirit, but his early work with Wow, What a Magazine. And this is just a brief, 20 seconds or minute to a full, 30-minute interview about Will Eisner.
There was a magazine called Wow, published by a guy named Henley, who was really a shirt manufacturer on 4th Avenue, but he had literary aspirations, and so he took the front of this big loft, made a little office there, hired a guy named Jerry Iger, Sam Iger was called Jerry, who had been working for Max Fleischer, doing little cartoons for Max Fleischer, made him editor and decided to publish a magazine called Wow, which was really formatted in imitation of the English magazines that combined stories and some pictures and some little adventure cartoons and so forth, and decided to publish this magazine called Wow. I found out about it. I don't remember how. I think it might have been Bob Kane told me about it because we were high school buddies. We'd see each other from time to very easily because we lived near each other. So he looked at my work, and I did a feature for them called Scott Dalton, which was the first adventure feature.
The next person is Julius Schwartz, who started out in the 1930s with his childhood friend Mort Weisinger as a science fiction pulp agent, and he did that for about 10 years. And then in 1946, he joined All American Comics under Shelley Mayer, and he has a lot of great anecdotes about the Golden Age. He was there when All American and Detective Comics fused into the National Periodical publications, and he, in a lot of people's opinion, helped essentially establish a Silver Age by overseeing the creation of the Justice League of America with the Flash, Green Lantern, the Silver Age versions. And I think his equation was use more relatable science fiction while retconning Golden Age characters, and it was a concept that worked really well, where I think after the JLA came out and that proved successful, then Stan Lee and Marvel is essentially a reaction to what Julius Schwartz oversaw over at DC.
By the way, two of his other clients when he was an agent were Ray Bradbury and Corey Ackerman, so he knew a lot of the people at the very beginning of the business.
One day, Shelley Mayer gets a newspaper strip that appears every day, and he got one about a character called Superman. It was done by a couple of kids named Siegel and Schuster. They had failed to sell it to the newspaper syndicates, but Gaines was putting out a magazine that was reprinting syndicate material. So they got the idea, hey, maybe they'll take a new one, and maybe some newspaper will pick it up. So they sent it to All American Comics. And Shelley Mayer was the one who saw it first. Well, he liked it, and he brought it into Max Gaines. He says, I think we can use this Superman character. And Gaines says, he says, wait a second. Harvey Donenfeld, my partner, in a sense, is putting out a magazine called Action Comics. And he hasn't got a lead feature for it. Let's send up the Superman character, maybe you go for it. So you see, Shelley Mayer was really the discoverer, in my opinion, this is a story I've heard and I believe it, the discoverer of Superman, going into Action Comics June 1938, and from then on it's history.
By the way, That's Julie's opinion.
Yeah, Julie's that interview. I really recommend everyone watch the whole thing. It's on the YouTube channel, but he's so alive and energetic, and it's just amazing that he had that much energy at that age. And when you watch it, it's like he just doesn't stop talking, and it's like pure energy the whole time. It's a real kick, actually.
But I must tell you, when I was interviewing, he'd say, "Ask me this question," because he had answers for them.
Yeah, he had prepared answers. That's totally right. So now the next one we're going to talk about is John Romita. Scott, why don't you introduce us to John Romita now?
Sure. John Romita Sr. is also very well known, having lived from 1930 and recently just passed this year. He's also from Brooklyn, New York, like Will Eisner, and a graduate of Manhattan School of Industrial Art in 1947. He began his work in comics with Famous Funnies in 1949, published by Eastern Color Printing, and then soon afterwards with Timely Comics, the sort of beginnings of Marvel Comics. By 1951, he was drawing a wide variety of genres for Atlas. The next development of Timely on the way to Marvel was to become Atlas Comics, and that includes war, romance, and horror comics, and he even began drawing Captain America in the 1950s. From 1958 to 1965, he worked for DC, mainly in romance comics, at that time known as National Periodical Publications. By 1965, he joins Marvel Comics, first drawing Daredevil, and then taking over the art duties in 1966 for The Amazing Spider-Man, following Steve Ditko, in which he combined his background with romance comics in the superhero genre and restylized not only the look of Spider-Man, but the entire book itself, introducing important characters like Mary Jane Watson, and it really relaunched the book as the #1 selling book for the company by 1967. In 1973, his influence on the entire look of Marvel was felt as he became the art director for Marvel Comics. So in the significance of this clip, it's just a brief part of Dave's full shoot interview, but in this one he speaks about learning inking from Joe Maneely. You know, a lot of times we'll celebrate an artist like John Romita Sr., but actually getting a window into how he learned is just really interesting in this clip.
Joe Maneely or Stan Lee, I think either right after my first job, maybe that IT job, or the second or third, must have noticed that I was not the best inker. He called up Joe Maneely, who had a studio in Flushing, Queens, and I lived on the city line about 15, 20 minutes away from there. So he told me, could you do me a favor? Could you go and spend a day with Joe Maneely at his studio? So I get in my little 36 Plymouth, whatever it was, with the tar roof, and I drove in, and I spent the day there. I got there about 10, and I left about 4. And before, he was working on a double spread Western scene of an Indian attack on a fort. It was like Kirby-esque. You know, you could see all the wood, all the structure of the fort, the way wooden stockades were made. You could see the Indians on horseback, all authentic, all reeking of authenticity, full of dynamics. They're circling the fort. Guys are shooting long rifles in buckskin from the fort. I mean, typical Boys Ranch kind of stuff. He's penciling that thing when I go there. He's talking to me a mile a minute, telling me how to structure a panel, how to work your figures in, how to make sure the background doesn't clash with it. He had this wonderful trick of doing his figures in a slightly bolder line than his backgrounds. And then when he did the ink work, he used a different pen for the backgrounds. He did a bolder pen for the foreground and a finer pen for the background. A great amount of depth, almost a 3D effect. He would do the whole thing in pen. After he blocked in the pencils very roughly, he would then rule up the page and start doing the inking immediately. And he would do a pen outline, contour drawing of everything on the page. And then he would do details. And then he would take a big brush, a number 5 brush or something, and start slashing blacks in there, which was also Kirby-esque. Joe Simon and Jack Kirby had worked out that principle. I could see it. They used a very thin brush or a pen to do the outline of all their drawings. And then Jack and Joe, or just Jack, would go in there with the blacks and do all the technique. So it was a wonderful assembly line approach, but it also had this great effect of when you do a contour drawing and you're forced to make it simple because you don't want to have the background clash with it. It's the secret of simplicity in comics and of clarity. And Joe Maneely had it nailed. He could do silhouettes, make you think you're looking at a character full of guns and knives and bristling with stuff, and the silhouette was as simple as can be. It was almost like a coloring book silhouette to some extent, only better. And then you would look at the finish and not believe all the stuff that's going on in the figure and in the background, but never once blending into each other, always clearly separated. And I immediately caught it. And he told me, he must have told me that that was the purpose. Because from that moment on, I understood the principle of clarity and depth in comics. And he did that double-page spread while he's telling me all this stuff, knocking it out, mindlessly clear. It was just a pleasure to watch.
I got to tell you, it was great. You know, one of the things that I wanted to do with this is be able to have artists and writers talk about people who are no longer with us, to be able to give us a picture of who they were and what they did. And that, to me, is worth $1 million bucks.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Now the next one is Irwin Donenfeld, and I find the business of comics just interesting, and decisions, distribution decisions. And his father, Harry Donenfeld, essentially co-founded what kind of becomes DC Comics with Major Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson. And then him and Jack Leibowitz kind of essentially run the show over at that company for a while. And then his son Irwin takes over. And what's interesting about Irwin is he has like a very business corporate side of looking at what happened during the Silver Age. And one clip we don't have is one where how we dealt with the Frederick Wortham stuff and how he would travel in different cities talking on behalf of Superman comics and talking about how they were good for kids, essentially doing a public relations tour. But this one is another really great clip because we talk about, or what he talks about, how his father and him would establish independent news's distribution relationships with different carriers around the country.
Since I was both in the publishing end and the distributing end, I knew pretty near every son of a distributor all around the country. Here in Bridgeport, there was the Rotman family. So Mickey Rotman was a very dear friend of mine, as an example. In Oklahoma City, Harvey Everest was the wholesaler. His son Gene and I were hunting buddies. Guy in Fayetteville, North Carolina, Fulton Tyler, he and I were hunting buddies. So I did that all around the country. I knew everybody. We'd go to a convention, and my father would be with the owners of all of these distributing companies, and I would be with all of their sons.
Now, the next one is a particular favorite of mine is John Broome. So, Bill, why don't you lead us into John Broome's clip?
Wow, what a guy John Broome was. He started comics in the Golden Age. He worked for DC. Three of his most notable titles back then, of course, he worked on the Golden Age Flash, he worked on Sargon the Sorcerer, and he also worked on Green Lantern. What was important about that period was he was the only writer to introduce screwball comedy through Green Lantern in the Golden Age. Now that would go on to be picked up in the Silver and Bronze Age and go on to become a staple of the industry in the 80s from the new Justice League #1 that was by DeMatteis and Keith Giffen. So he really was instrumental in a lot of the evolution of how that happened from him introducing more comedic elements. It's amazing, he's won all three of the major awards in the industry, the Eisner, Ink Pot, and the Finger Award. He created some of the Silver Age's greatest characters. He created Kid Flash, created Elongated Man. He created Phantom Stranger in 1952. He created Detective Chimp. He created Guy Gardner, which is now a very important character. It's going to be portrayed in film by Nathan Fillion. He was just a guy who people didn't really know what he did. He created almost all of the Silver Age Flash villains, Captain Boomerang, et al., everything you can think of. But he died in Thailand after teaching English in Japan. Just a really colorful character, and I think you're going to get that from the next clip.
Did you have a lot of contact with the other writers in the business?
Sure, I was. It took me a whole year, or at least it seems to me now. It took a whole year for me. I was the leader and the ringleader, you might say, in the attempts to form a union among the writers, not the artists, but the writers. We couldn't get the artists. They were getting too much money. But the writers, we had a chance with the writers, and I collected the 6 main writers, Otto Binder among them, and it took a whole year and got them into Leibowitz's office in the right temper, with the right feeling. And my whole idea was simply to gain reprint rights, which we didn't have yet. And they were reprinting our material without paying us. And I thought that was a kind of a crime. I was very happy when we finally marched into Leibowitz's office, and maybe I began to open my mouth. No sooner did he get sight of me than Leibowitz says to the boys, he says, I don't know why you came in here like this, because I'm just getting ready to give you a raise of $2 a page. Well, at that moment, the whole union collapsed. Everybody was so happy to get $2 a page, and I was disgusted. I was thoroughly disgusted, and I couldn't do anything. It just dissolved.
Yeah.
So I have to tell you a quick story about John Broome. I met John and Peggy through Julius Schwartz, and Peggy lived in Paris, and John lived in Tokyo half the year because he taught English in Tokyo. And I was doing business. I ended up going to take Peggy to lunch one day in Paris, and then I ended up going to Tokyo about Christmas time. And I met both of them there because they end up getting together in Tokyo, and then they go to Chiang Mai, Thailand for a month for their vacation for the year. So I go to lunch with him, and we go to this, Japanese restaurant, and I said to him at lunch, how's your Japanese? And he looked at me with this kind of puzzled look. He goes, I don't speak any Japanese. I go, well, you're here half the year. How do communicate like what you want to eat? And he pulls up the menu, which has pictures, and he points to it. And I said, that's all you do when you order stuff? He goes, yeah. I said, how do you get the check? He said, I'm done.
All right, so now the next clip is Ramona Fradon. So Dave, why don't you take us into that one?
So Ramona Fradon is, I always get a kick out of this. She started drawing, I think she did Shining Knight first, but then she did Aquaman. She started drawing the year I was born, 1951. So I always wanted to interview her, and the funny thing is, I always thought that, because she had done Aquaman, that would be her favorite. She loved Metamorpho, and she loved Plastic Man. She did Aquaman for like 15 years as the backup feature in Adventure before it became its own book, and then by then Nick Hardy did it. But she had given up being a professional artist to raise her daughter, so she didn't come back to comics until the late 60s, early 70s, when Metamorpho and the return of Plastic Man under DC came about. But there's one fun. She ended up turning in a story that she penciled, and she said to the editor, and I can't remember who it was, I'm not sure that I'm going to have enough time to ink it. You can get someone else to ink my stuff. And the editor looked at her and said, you have a unique style. I can't get someone else to ink your stuff. And she couldn't. It took her a long time to understand that she had a different style than everyone else that were in the business. Because she never went into the office and compared stuff with anyone else. She just worked at home for the most part. But it was interesting to me that she didn't think that she had any particular style. When if you look at an Aquaman story, you can tell the difference between Ramona's work and obviously like Nick Hardy or anyone else who worked on the strip. So she's always upset about the interview because she had a little bit of a cold, so you'll have to pardon her for that.
Did it ever occur to you that there weren't that many other women working in the business?
Oh, I always knew that. Yeah, I always knew that. And I had a daily identity crisis. I mean, sometimes I'd sit there and I'd be drawing these people smashing each other in the face, and doing all this stuff. And I thought, what on earth am I doing here, But I remember one time saying to some friends of mine, you know, we were speculating about why there weren't any women in cartooning. And I said, well, I think it's because women aren't violent. And they both laughed at me. And this was way back in the 60s, you know. I have to acknowledge that I have violence in me. This is an outlet. This was an outlet for me, you know. I don't know if I'm unusual or if I'm just more aware of that in myself, you know. I know that when I see most women's drawing, they want to draw very sweet things, you know. And I don't think that they really can draw the kind of things that I've been drawing. So it's a kind of a problematic area for me. I have to wonder, you know.
Maybe you're just more talented.
Well, I don't know. I know that I have the ability to feel, when I'm drawing a male figure, to feel that, and when I'm drawing a female figure, to feel that. I can move in and out of those two identities. I notice that with many men who draw women, they look like men. They've got that kind of muscle-bound look. They can't switch over, but I think I can do that.
Yeah, hers was like more an existential interview, I noticed. All right, so the next is Arnold Drake, and I think the only Arnold Drake video I've seen. So.
Yeah, well, Arnold Drake is also a unique character, and also is very outspoken about page rates. But Arnold Drake basically got into the industry through a hookup through Bob Kane, and he'd also suffered scarlet fever as a child. I don't know if that had anything to do with some of the ways he wrote, but later on, because he wrote afflicted characters very, very well. Believe it or not, he drew most of Showcase #1, and of course we know now, Showcase went on to be the usher to all the great characters from the Silver Age from DC. He created Tommy Tomorrow and a few other sci-fi characters. Now what he's really known for, and probably most everybody here is aware of this, he created the Doom Patrol, and with Bruno Premiani. He wrote every story. He co-wrote the first story with Bob Haney, but he wrote every story of the Doom Patrol. And while writing the last issue of the Doom Patrol, he pissed off Irwin Donenfeld because he had gone to work for Marvel because they gave him a higher page rate. So Irwin said, "You won't work here anymore," and he basically, that was true, but he wanted to carry out the series, which was amazing, but he always fought for the rights of writers, just like, you know, John Broome did. And he was integral in creating a character like Robot Man, who was very Ben Grimmish in the sense that he was this man who was trapped in a body that he didn't want to be in. He also went on, of course, to write for both the Brotherhood of Evil in Doom Patrol, which he created, and then when he went to Marvel for X-Men, he went on to write the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, who were created by Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. But he was very prolific. He let's let him speak for himself.
I think Premiani was extraordinary, really extraordinary. I've seen other guys try to do what he did, and they just don't make it. I often use the word the term artistic integrity, and it's not really a bullshit term. It has significance. He had that. He, fortunately, in addition to that, he had practicality. He had lived under two dictators, Mussolini and Perón, and he had learned practicality. So when he would get into a disagreement with Murray about something that he had drawn, he would finally accede to Murray's demand, and he inevitably would say, "I will do it, Murray, but it will be very poor."
I found interesting about the Drake interview, if you go online and watch it, is he kept warning Irwin Donenfeld, "Look, I'm serious. What Stanley's doing over at Marvel, they're going to become something, and we're going to be left in the dust." And they just wouldn't listen to him. And it's just so interesting that, because he was like kind of the quirky writer of the 60s in DC, kind of. because the Doom Patrol run is so unique, that he could tell what Stan was kind of doing, but everyone else there seemed somewhat oblivious, like, well, let's just put more gorillas on the cover or something, and we'll counteract it. But he even told Irwin, like, we could do something here to prevent that and cut this off of the past, but Irwin just kind of didn't go for it.
You know that he was talking about Murray Boltinoff as his editor at that point. That's who he's referring to when he talked about it.
But he does say he talked to Irwin in that interview too.
Yeah.
All right. So now the next part is some of the footage that I know a lot of people are also here to see. We're going to go over. So Dave also did a lot of interviews with the EC people.
So,
let's talk about that.
Yeah, I came to in 2000, the American Association of Comicbook Collectors had a dinner, and it was basically to honor the EC guys who came to the reunion. And there were two really wonderful guitar players who went up on stage to do two little ditties. Oh, Grant's in the audience, so there you go. So,
Grammy nominated Grant Geisman.
Grant Geisman, thank you. So I interviewed all the EC guys that showed up, with the exception of Al Williamson, and we had some issues with Al. So we haven't put them on YouTube with the rest of the interviews because we're thinking very seriously about doing a documentary. Bill's very excited about it. And the thing is, we'll probably use is that dinner, which basically introduces everyone and hands out awards, as our framing device, because I have, much deeper interviews. The interview I did with Feldstein is about an hour long. Each of the other interviews are about half an hour. But, Jack came and, well, you'll see who's in here. The only interviews that are missing, I'm not sure.
There's a couple that we didn't.
We didn't put in there. We didn't put Rick Estrada in there, and we didn't put in Angela Torres. But other than that, all the people who showed up, with the exception of Al Williamson, are included in this next clip. And before we go and talk about that,
yeah, I just wanted to interject. We talked about this earlier when we were talking this morning about doing this. Jack Davis, his interview is an epiphany to me. I didn't know. I never got a chance to meet Jack. But the interesting thing about what you're probably going to see here is Jack did not really enjoy drawing horror comics. They were horrifying. They were horrifying to me. And he also said that he burned his own comics along with the people that were burning comics, which I'm like, that blew my mind. And he realized from then on, he was a funny artist. He made people laugh. He made people, just explode with humor. And the main thing is, he went on, of course, to be prolific at Mad Magazine, but even more so, he was, at one time, the highest paid commercial artist in the United States. And you see his work in more places, more often than any other comic artist. And he was prolific as hell, and he was a Southern gentleman, which was also something of a unique thing to comics, because a lot of the talent came from the East Coast, of course. So let's go.
What you're going to see is about a 6-minute clip that has all of those interviews that we just talked about together, so you can get a feel for how the EC interviews went.
Why don't we be innovators instead of imitators? Why don't we start our own genres? And that's how we got into talking about what we liked as kids and what we thought would sell. And I had remembered when I was a kid sneaking down the stairs to listen to The Witch's Tale, because my brother was listening to it with his friends 12 o'clock at night while he was babysitting for me. And The Witch's Tale, and Lights Out, and Inner Sanctum, and Frankenstein the movie, and Dracula, and let's put horror into comics. Now it wasn't the first time. There was Adventures into the Unknown, but it was kind of wimpy. And what I wanted to do was, really scare the pants off these kids. And so he said, well, why don't we try it? So the Crypt of Terror, which I first created and wrote with a host, because I was impressed by the old witch who used to cackle and have a cat. And so she was 100 and some odd years old, and she was going to tell the story. So I had the Crypt Keeper tell the story, and the Crypt of Terror, and then that was tried out in his crime book, Crime Patrol. And then we tried out the Vault of Horror, which I also wrote, drew, in War Against Crime. And in those days, distributors had roadmen that would go around and check the newsstand, and if they got 20 issues of something on July the 3rd and 7 of them were sold by July the 20th, they were going to have a 70% sale of the total print order or whatever. They had to figure it out. And suddenly, War Against Crime and Crime Patrol showed good checkups. And Bill said, you know, Bill was no dope. I mean, it was that thing that we had introduced, that new trend, a new trend in comics, the Crypt of Terror, which we changed fortuitously to Tales from the Crypt, and the Vault of Horror. And then later on we did the Witch's Cauldron, who got her own book, Haunt of Fear, and that was the beginning of our horror comics.
Al Feldstein, you know, and gave me a script right away. And every time I'd come in with a job, Bill Gaines, the publisher, would pay me, give me a check right there on the spot. I didn't have to bill him or anything like that. And so I started working fast just to take a script home and do it and come back in. And that's where it all started.
When you got a script from Bill, was it a written script, or did he give a layout of the story?
There would be a written script. And I'd sit down with Al Feldstein and read it, and we'd go over it. But now Harvey would practically draw his stories on tracing paper, and he'd sit down with you and read it to you and almost act it out. So you'd go home, and he was really a perfectionist with what he wanted done. And Al was a little more lenient, you know, and I'd just take it home and do it and come back, and it was pretty horrible stuff. I mean, it got to be gruesome, you know, and I didn't know what I was doing.
Did you think that a lot of the stories that they did suited their characters?
Well, as far as I know, Al Feldstein, the writer, tried to gear the certain adaptations to the way he thought, he was a very good art director, to the way they would like to interpret it. You know, with EC, they didn't have the wild panels, it was continuity. Al wrote his stories right on the boards, you know. He didn't da-da-da-da-da. He wrote it in pencil on the boards. And so the guys were restricted to square panels, but that was good. The continuity was there. Once in a great while, a guy would ask to lay out his own pages with Al. Couldn't do that with Harvey. Harvey laid out and did pencil sketches and little goofy stuff, which were delightful. However, it's very intimidating to get a piece of art that you have to do and somebody's laid it out and also been already funny, and you're restricted. All of a sudden, sometimes your mind clicks and I can't do that like him. This is so funny. It's doing it the second time, and it loses something. But a lot of the guys got over that, or just would grumble about it. But you look at Mad Magazine, it came out great anyway.
Harvey was my alter ego. We thought alike, we enjoyed the same things, we loved music, I mean, everything to do with cartoons. We appreciated good art, and I thought, well, this is my brother. I mean, what's not to like working for your brother? And that's how it all began.
Were you surprised at how successful Mad was?
Not really. It became that way gradually. In fact, I am actually impressed by what's happened to Mad today, this very day we're living. But not then, because it was a slow gradation of the book becoming more popular. Or children will love the simple things, you know, like Mickey Mouse growing a fifth finger. I mean, the guy's been walking around for years with 4 fingers. That's crazy.
Are you familiar with Kamen's Calamity? Oh, well, they wrote a whole story about how that was at the onset of the horror comics, which, you know, I found a little difficult to do with the other guys doing all horrible, you know, decapitations or whatever. So I don't do that stuff, you know. But Al wrote particular stories for me, basically always involving, like he said, it was always a nice, friendly story where Papa was always the head of the family, and the end of the story was that the wife kills the husband in some fashion or other. And basically he said, you come with me permanently, he says, you'll be busy all the time. And so, you know, it was a great sense of security. And I was with Gaines until I left.
So a couple things. I just want to say that I hadn't seen these interviews in 20 some odd years when Alex convinced me to upconvert them. They hold up remarkably well. And it's fascinating to see the people talk about our industry in such intimate terms. I mean, it served the purpose that I really liked. That's number one. Number two, you have to realize that Alex Grand edited all these, and all of the, you know, the images that you see other than the talking head, for the most part, were edited and produced by Alex. I gave him a bunch of comic book pages, but you can see there's far more than just comic book pages in this stuff, and he did a phenomenal job.
But it should be noted that it's intimate terms because they liked David. That's actually the reason, because they liked him, they trusted him. He already had a relationship with them. He's already had lunch with them. He already did all sorts of things. So this is like talking between two friends, each of these interviews. That's why it's so interesting to see it, you know, play in front of you.
So we've got one clip to close out the show. This is for everyone who goes to comic book conventions.
Still gonna do shows?
Oh yeah, I love them. They're really a lot of fun.
You get to meet all the people that you never.
Yeah, I know. It's a nice thing, and it's nice to meet the fans. I was so touched the first time I came here. It was the first show that I'd been to in 20 years, and when I see these fans, you know, around 30 years old, 35 years old, who had read Aquaman when they were kids, they'd come up and they'd look at my drawings, and they all have this look on their face that is so sweet. You know, they get this little smile, and you can just see that they're going back, you know, and that was a great pleasure for me to see that. You know, I began to realize that I'd given them something valuable, really.
It wasn't just a job.
Yeah, it wasn't just a job.
And she stopped for water in the middle of those cuts, so that's all that was.
Thank you all for coming. These are just some brief excerpts of the interviews. There's at least 40 that David has done. If you go to the YouTube channel for comic book historians, you can see them in full. There's also at least another almost 100 interviews that Alex and colleagues have done. So thank you all for coming, and please check out the Comic Book Historians' social media.
Thank you, everybody.
And Alex and I also wrote this little baby about Neal Adams, which is pretty great, you know. But I have to give Alex a lot of credit. Alex has basically single-handedly changed and morphed the comic historian into something that people appreciate and they respect. And I want to give you a round of applause for that.
Hey. That was...
He has definitely focused the field, let's put it that way.
Yes. Okay. This Bill Field, at least.
Yeah, at least I focused Bill Field, and I'll take credit for that.
And I am ADD, so it helps.